And we're live. Welcome back, everyone. Onan here. I'm happy to have DW Lafferty on today. We're live streaming. How are you today?
Doing very well, thanks.
Thanks for making time. I know we've sort of exchanged on Twitter for a little while, and I've been sort of interested in talking to you for a while, and finally we're able to make that happen. I know that we have some people interested in this conversation. So with that in mind, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us anything that you might be okay with us knowing, and then let's start talking.
Sure. I go by DW Lafferty online or Right Scholar on Twitter, or X. Dave is fine. Dave or David Lafferty is good for chatting. So I'm a person who is from Canada. I'm from Ottawa, Ontario. I got, involved in the faith. Oh, hey, there's Mike Lewis.
Oh,
Excellent.
wow.
I got I got involved, in taking, I guess, my faith seriously a little later in life than some people. So it would have been in my early 30s that I actually went through RCA, even though I was baptized Catholic, but came from a more or less non-practicing family. Got serious about my faith, and I spent some time being a fairly uncompromising Catholic, like I think a lot of people who are converting or reverting tend to do. That was kind of my story for a while, and I was in academia. Now I work in higher ed. Still, I'm not a professor, but I work in higher ed. Um, I ended up getting into Catholic Twitter, during the 2010s there, and finding an interesting community there where people were talking about difficult issues and all that kind of stuff. So that was really fascinating to me. I think it was around maybe 2018 that for me things started to take a bit of a turn. And this was when I started having concerns about some forms of Catholicism in the church, conservative Catholicism in some ways, and traditionalist Catholicism. And this was around the time that we had Archbishop Vigano launching attacks on Pope Francis. That was a big red flag for me, and it started a trend where I started to, I guess, look critically at the church. So that's how I ended up becoming, I guess, sort of a critical voice, maybe, I guess, on Catholic Twitter. I contributed to the Where Peter Is site, which Mike Lewis runs, which is just a fantastic site that's been going for quite a long time now, sort of a beacon of sanity for a lot of Catholics, I think, who want to get past all the nonsense around some of the attacks on Pope Francis. I'm maybe not as sort of orthodox as they are nowadays. I've maybe gone a little further into the realm of deconstruction, but I still have a lot of respect for Mike Lewis and what he does. But so I guess that's what within the sort of Catholic sphere, I've developed maybe a bit of a voice online talking about some of these issues. Was covered in a couple of Vanity Fair articles that also covered Where Peter Is, looking at some of the sort of infiltration of Trumpism into the church and that kind of thing. But yeah, I just kind of I've enjoyed your coming into contact with you online, and seeing how with your podcasts and discussions, you're grappling with some, I think, really important things that I think a lot of Catholic men grapple with, men and women. But it's nice that you're bringing in the male perspective there. So I guess that gives you a bit of an intro to why I might be here. Yeah.
Can you tell us anything about your state in life, family, anything like that, or?
Sure. I'm married. I have kids. I originally, I would have liked to have been a professional academic, but and I did my PhD in um, an interdisciplinary program, but coming from a literature studies perspective, I looked at the author Wyndham Lewis, who was a British modernist author from the early to mid 20th century. But as anyone who is in academia these days knows, the job market's very tough. So I knew that wasn't going to be a sort of realistic option. But I'm still um, always, thinking about things and working on various, semi-scholarly projects and things like that. And I think some of the things that I look at when it comes to Catholicism sort of feed into that. I think the critical perspective that I picked up um, during my during graduate studies has helped me, analyze the church. I think and see some of the uh, larger issues at play. Anyway.
In your Twitter bio, you refer to yourself as a disaffected Catholic. What do you mean by that?
So yeah, for me, I mean, at first I would have considered myself like a hardcore sort of conservative Catholic. I was never a traditionalist.
Okay.
At some time, there was one point where I guess I was around a lot of people who were in that sort of zone, but I never got into it myself. But yeah, over time, some things I guess happened, and that kind of changed my relationship to conservative Catholicism specifically. And so, one of them to begin with was I guess you'd call it the revolt against Pope Francis. That
Hmm.
was very significant to me. So, I when I went through RCIA and I decided to take my faith seriously, and I was confirmed at my early 30s. One of the things that was hardest for me to accept was this idea of papal authority and submission of the intellect and will. And it was very, very difficult because, again, I was coming from much more of a sort of critical perspective, where you would never even imagine just sort of giving yourself up that way. So that was very difficult for me. And then I was kind of able to do that. I was able to overcome that. But then to see that the same
Hmm.
people who had demanded a kind of ultramontanism, or a kind of papal, absolutism, all of a sudden turn and
Hmm.
say that no, we got to throw this all out because we need to be able to criticize what the Pope is saying, what the Pope is doing. Often it was on a very sort of the basis of, I think, misinterpretations and all that. But yeah, it was really disillusioning in that respect, and so that sort of started to crumble a little bit. Um, Later on, I think the pandemic had a big effect on me as well. I saw on one level Pope Francis taking this incredible leading role during the pandemic, being a sort of figure of hope and unity, and encouraging people to just like come together. We're going to get through this. When the vaccines came out, he was asking people to take them.
Hmm.
To we just need to do this. We need to get through this. This is our moral responsibility. And then we had this sort of revolt again within the church against this. And I'm not saying that there weren't sometimes good reasons to be critical of certain aspects of the lockdown or lockdowns, or maybe some of the mandates and things like that. I'm not saying that that was completely irrational or anything like that. But on the whole, I noticed this real resistance coming from especially the conservative and traditionalist wing of the church. And it was very much connected to this larger sort of populist Trumpist movement at the same time. So again, that was very disillusioning to me as well. This was not how I thought Catholics, and especially pro-life Catholics, who are supposed to protect the vulnerable, keep even if it means sacrificing, even if it means you have to stay inside, even if it means you have to take this vaccine. We want to keep, old people, people who are in, very, maybe have a weak immune systems. We want to keep these people safe. And then to see other Catholics recommending that, these people just be kind of forgotten about because we need to get on with our lives, that shocked me. So again, it's I guess there's been sort of a series of things that have happened over time, and I mean the events that have gone on in the U.S. haven't helped, for sure, the political atmosphere, and I think over time I started taking a much more critical look at Catholicism, but also looking at other aspects of Christian tradition and other, other denominations, other theologians, other ideas that I find fascinating that maybe don't quite fit with Catholicism, but which are interesting nonetheless. So I think my view now is, I go to church. My whole family, we go to church, and it's a part of our lives still. And I listen to what is going on in the church, and I respect all that. But at the same time, I almost feel like I got pushed outside it. Like, I don't feel like it wasn't necessarily even me trying, leaving, but there was a sort of some kind of force that was like pushing me outside. So I do feel like I'm a bit disaffected in that way, in that I feel like I've been let down in some ways by the institutional church, and maybe I just feel like I'm a bit on the outside looking in, but I actually think that this is a good place to be for me, in that I need to have that critical perspective. I need to be able to push back on certain things and be able to say certain things without thinking, that I'm crossing some line when it comes to orthodoxy.
When you talk about the institutional church, do you distinguish that from sort of Pope Francis's reign? Because I just find that to be such an interesting dynamic, because Pope Francis strikes me as being much more of a, what's the word I'm looking for? More of a progressive type pope, and yet does the institution not follow suit? Or do you find yourself more critical of things even than Pope Francis? How would you sort of characterize that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that Pope Francis is progressive in a certain sense, but I don't think he's a sort of liberal Catholic along the lines of the type of Catholicism we might see in Germany.
Yeah.
When it comes to liberal Catholicism, it's funny because in my experience, I've mainly known a more conservative Catholicism. I haven't, you hear trads talking about like the days when, it was like clown masses and, and all these heresies were just all over the place. I've never seen that myself. I've always, now it may just be the Canadian context, but it was always a sort of John Paul II, conservative Catholicism. Now it was very, it wasn't always sort of like an in-your-face type thing. I think maybe there's an urge, or a lot of people feel that they want to see priests and bishops who really say the hard things to people, and really say what needs to be said, and they're brave, and they're taking on abortion and contraception and all these issues, and being really uncompromising about them. So I didn't see that kind of stuff so much, but I did see just a generally conservative Catholicism, and I think Pope Francis, I would say it's a more dynamic Catholicism. It's one where the lines are a little blurred in some cases. It's a more a less sort of doctrinaire, like it's less focused on moral theology and the intricacies of moral theology, and more on the movement of the Holy Spirit and that sort of thing. And it might be that sort of Latin American approach. And I do feel that it's more focused on people than it is focused on the institutional church. At the same time, though, I've been critical of some things that Pope Francis has done too. So and it took me a while to be able to be critical of some of Pope Francis's statements. There are some things where I agree with them, but I don't agree with the way that he's, maybe, or the way that the institutional church is tackling a particular issue. I felt that way with their statement on transgender people and transgender Catholics. I mean, I have sort of, moral theological issues with the whole concept of transgenderism, and so it's not something that's like an unproblematic thing for me. But at the same time, the way that they were arguing didn't seem convincing to me. It seemed too simplistic, too essentialist. It didn't seem like it would actually change anyone's mind. So there are some cases like that where I have, I guess, maybe pushed back a little bit. Even with the whole gay blessings issue, I felt that it was almost, it amounted to basically kind of nothing in the end. It was just like there was very little to it. And so it was almost, if you feel a bit cheated, where it seems like they're doing something, but they're not really doing it. Like there's a lot of loopholes and sort of very praising. But I think this is all part of the really interesting dynamic of the church, and I think I've come to see the church as much more of a collection of sort of things in tension, whether it's like factions in tension, or ideas in tension, or history in tension with modernity and the present, and all these kind of things. And that, to me, explains so much of what's going on in the church, much better than any kind of way to try to figure it out from a kind of doctrinal perspective. So I guess that's where I'm at these days.
Well, I would love to talk to you maybe on another time more about what happened in 2020 and all that. But for today, I want to kind of hone in a little bit on the stuff that's near and dear to my heart. And for those that know you but don't know me, my background's a little different. I was baptized Catholic. My parents both are from big Catholic families, but we were nominal Catholics. I mean, we always went to mass, but got the sacraments, but didn't get real serious until I was a teenager. And then we got super serious. And then we were going to Latin mass, in part, I would say, because the diocese we were in was, I wouldn't say it was clown masses, but it was really pushing the envelope a lot of times. And so we went to the Latin mass just to be like, well, now it just felt very relieving to go to a mass and not wonder what's going to happen next. And so that kind of got us into traditionalism. And then I ended up in the seminary for a while, not in a Latin mass, but in a very conservative diocese. And then I can't even remember exactly how the evolution happened, but got married. And I was all excited. I read all of the Theology, the body stuff. I was like, oh, this is great. This is the good news. Got married, learned NFP, started having kids, started having a lot of kids, and found that the realities of marriage, trying to be a good Catholic, so to speak, were not as advertised, and much, much more difficult, not just from a practical standpoint, but morally. I was so distraught at how seemingly impossible it is to live this life and follow all the rules that I was more or less told, especially as a man, to the point where I started questioning some of this. I'm like, either I can't be this bad, like I can't be this much of a failure. And I'm not sure that the church's teaching is wrong, but I saw this disconnect between what the church teaches and maybe what celibate's experience is like and what it's like as a married person. And I also see great differences between how a lot of women perceive NFP and all that, and men. And as I got older, and as my kids are, I have 9 kids, and I got to the point where I'm not sure I want my kids to get married. I was so frustrated, because I thought this just felt like a constant challenge to my faith and my moral life, just trying to be a good, not using contraception, all that. Not even that. That isn't actually the hard part. It's all the other rules that seem to go with it that I find to be just so difficult, if not impossible, that I was like, something's missing here. And so, having kind of stepped into this space and started talking about it, I understand that there is good people are struggling, and I used to be very judgmental of the, let's say, those that are using contraception. Now I have empathy, even though we've never gone down that road and not really interested in going down the road. I understand it. And there seems to be this impression. I was listening to a podcast this morning. I won't name it, but sort of a Theology, the Body, female podcast, talking about this, and it's basically said marriage is supposed to be suffering. It's supposed to be hard. That's our job as Catholics. And that was more or less the proof that the rules are right, that they're hard. And I think there's hard, and then I think there's nearly impossible. I think anyone I have come to learn that marriage is hard regardless of your circumstances in life. There's no easy level of marriage. There's just different levels of difficulty. And I know from talking to even non-Catholics that don't have any particular qualms with things like contraception, those marriages are hard. They have difficulties. Raising children is difficult. And then if you're not using contraception and using NFP or whatever, that's hard. And then you add extra layers of hard when you're saying, okay, now you've got to abstain. You may have to live like brother and sister for months, if not years at a time. And well, that's hard. Yeah, well, that's where I think that's borderline impossible. And now I see a lot of people moving, really following traditionalism. Now they're saying NFP, you can't even use NFP. That's immoral. Just it's sort of like quivers full, have as many God's providence and all that. And I don't know what to make of any of it at this point in time. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I have many thoughts on that, but I like what you said though about how marriage is very difficult for all types of people, no matter what your circumstances are, whether and whether you have kids or you don't have kids, or the number of kids you have. It's always very difficult to negotiate marriage and family. And I think anyone who's been able to keep their marriage and their family together for a while should congratulate themselves, because a lot of people don't. Like, it's very easy for marriages to fall apart, sadly. But yeah, I think that there are certain demands that Catholicism places on people who want to take the faith seriously, that just add a whole extra layer of complexity. And what makes it so difficult is, well, for one thing, this is, I think, a trend within the church as a whole. There's a tendency to present things from one side only. So it's kind of like when you read like a hagiography of a saint or something, right? Like, you only get all these wonderful things that the saint did, and you never get any of the sort of less good stuff, right? Like that, which is actually in some ways more interesting, or at least as interesting as some of the good stuff they did. You get this sort of a bit of a false picture, and I think you get that when it comes to things like NFP as well. There's sometimes this not necessarily false, but at least a misleading picture that's offered, because we know that NFP can be effective, but it's only really very effective in kind of perfect circumstances. And the problem is, most people don't live in perfect circumstances. They don't have perfect relationships. They don't have, even just things like when it comes to the sort of the rhythms of the body and all of that, right? And even just things like the time when people have to get up for work or go to bed and all these kind of things, they all affect potentially NFP. So I think a lot of people end up feeling let down by it in the end. So yeah, there's this kind of tension that never goes away. I've come to see this tension as something that's sort of, it's something that's built into the church. I think that the way that this teaching developed and the way that it was expressed in Humanae Vitae ended up capturing attention that still hasn't been really resolved. And I don't know if it's even possible to resolve it. So, I mean, I'm getting more into sort of, moral theological territory. Okay. Yeah, but I've done some, investigation into this time period around when the Second Vatican Council was happening, so during the 60s, and there was a sort of growing consensus, I think, in the Catholic world that there needed to be some changes made on when it came to sexuality. Not huge changes, not like it wasn't, I really don't think that the consensus was like, we're going to have free love and all this kind of stuff, right? It was more, I think, specifically about masturbation was one thing that that maybe there could be a way to see it as something that's not always wrong. And then the other one would be contraception, that maybe in some instances married couples could use contraception, especially when it came to the pill. So there was a variety of kind of new theological approaches around that time. So like situational ethics or proportionalism. These were examples of how maybe like a rule can hold in most cases, but if there's a proportional reason for it, for you to sort of disobey the rule, then that might be okay. Or you're people looking at like, can the church change? It's changed, on teachings like usury in the past. Could it do the same when it came to contraception? And I think that's what I think we would have seen if Humanae Vitae had gone differently. It would have been like these sort of subtle changes where you might have seen, yes, you can use contraception in certain cases, but you have to remain open to life in general, or that sort of thing, right? Maybe not every sort of sex act order towards procreation, but you should, if you're a couple, always think about creation as something you're working towards when you have the means and the ability to do it. That kind of idea. And then Humanae Vitae comes along, and it's, I think it's as big an event as the Second Vatican Council itself in a lot of ways, because it created this tension, I think, that just hasn't been resolved. So when I'm talking about these things that are held in tension, and that's what I see in Humanae Vitae. You have this sort of Aristotelian understanding of the sex act and how it's ordered towards procreation, which is a very old understanding that comes from, a very old type of biology / metaphysics. Then you have it sort of mixed with a newer, more modern understanding of sexuality within marriage, something like a more sympathetic understanding of sexuality within marriage than you find in like earlier church documents. But the only sort of option that they're able to provide, or that the document was able to provide, was this sort of natural family planning option, which again, I think stands in tension as well, because one of the arguments in Humanae Vitae against contraception is that you're taking this sort of godlike role in trying to control the human body, right? But you look at NFP and how complicated it can get. You have like these, you can have machines and test strips and all this kind of stuff, and it's, well, you're kind of doing the same thing, right? Like So when the trads, like when traditionalists reject NFP, I think in a way they have a point in that it doesn't quite fit with some of the other things that are said in Humanae Vitae. So, but yeah, I think that anyone who's a married Catholic trying to take their faith seriously is caught in this sort of trap. And I think a big part of the trap is that Paul VI, when at the time of Humanae Vitae, I think he understood the need to do something. That I think he understood that he was maybe at least somewhat sympathetic towards the idea that some people just needed some way to be able to space births, especially in the modern world where you have a lot of people living, you have more women in the workforce, you have more like kind of urban societies, that kind of thing. But at the same time, it was to actually change a teaching that had been so recently sort of reinforced and unequivocally stated, would have been disastrous for the church in terms of its truth claims, right? So that, I think he was caught in a sort of very difficult situation there too, tried to do the best he could, but that tension then gets transferred onto almost every married couple in the church who's trying to do things right, if that makes any sense.
Well, it does. It feels, I mean, I get the problem Paul VI was dealing with, but by them kind of punting on it and giving a non-realistic alternative to people, it's like you said, it's transferred that into every couple, and it affects the families and the children that I see play out in our marriage. That really bothers me, because you're dealing with people's lives here. You're the environment that children grow up. You want us to have kids. You want us to be open to life, and great, fine. But you're making it nearly impossible for most people to have an environment where the husband and wife have a good functioning intimate life. That's the sort of the foundation for that, when they're constantly in tension with something, either it's each other, NFP, God, the church, whatever. Like it never seems to let up. I haven't seen it let up, and I'm 20 some years into this, and so that it seems to me, and I'm not sure, this is just me speaking here, but it seems to me the church has had this tendency, as being kind of a slow moving vehicle, to react to problems too late, before, when the sort of the cat's out of the bag a little bit. Casti Connubii came out in the 1930s, sort of reacting to, was it the Lambeth Conference the Anglicans had? They really,
Anglican, yeah.
I don't know that it was necessarily their plan, Pius was it the 11th plan to talk about that, but they had to react to that. And then, by the time Humanae Vitae came around, I mean, again, I think people were so fed up with this that it was just a little too late to do something about it. And, and this is the mess that we have.
And I think, again, part of it is because the Catholic Church has sort of made this its stand, right? After Humanae Vitae, and then John Paul II especially, really emphasized this, there could be no compromise on this. And so, because it's this idea that if you make just one little change here, then everything else starts falling apart. That now we can just ignore teaching abortion, we can just ignore teaching on this or that. And now, I don't personally think that it has to work that way. I don't think that I think it's the church doesn't just stand on its doctrine in terms of moral theology. Like I think personally that we should be able to look at those things critically and change them if need be. Now, I'm not talking about like dogma. I'm not talking about I'm talking about these things that relate to stuff that we're still learning about. I mean, when it comes to something like masturbation, so this is another one of these big topics. There was an increasing consensus, I think, among doctors, psychologists, in the 50s, 60s, that this wasn't something that is going to cause irreparable harm to you. It's not going to make you blind. It's not going to, turn you into a, deviant criminal or something like that. Not to say that there aren't like issues here, like you don't want to spend the day whatever. But
Right.
But the idea was that it's not, maybe it could be considered a part of sort of natural sexual development, and even a healthy part of natural sexual development, and something that we shouldn't be so critical about. I think the church dealt with that by if you look in the the Catechism, it says that it takes the diminished culpability approach, basically saying that in many cases, because of habit, because of inability to the strong emotions involved or something like that, there's going to be a diminishment of culpability, almost to the point where it's not something that is really that much of an issue in some cases. So they've used that diminished culpability thing to create a little flexibility, but without actually saying it's okay to, and I think we've seen that a bit in the way the church has approached contraception. You had sort of a hard line taken by the Vatican, but then a lot of bishops and priests on a ground level after Humanae Vitae take a more sort of, do your best, and, there's diminished capability, or like the Canadian bishops had a statement in I think it was 1968, like after Humanae Vitae. It's called the Winnipeg Statement, where they said that, if you are unable to assent to this genuinely, as a couple, if you're unable, you've tried to understand the church's teaching on this and you can't, and then in that case you're okay because you're following your conscience. And now there's been a lot of controversy about that particular statement. It's kind of notorious among some people, but I think they've tried to go in that more sort of conscious, appealing to conscience or to diminish ability, to ease some of that tension. But I don't think the tension is still there, even within that.
Yeah, I mean, I've read 2352 of the Catechism a lot. The more I read it, the less I am satisfied by it. But I think, just to be very blunt about it, I think expecting couples to not use contraception, so anytime you come together in the conjugal act, it has to be open to life, and also the only way that you can licitly sexually enjoy yourselves is through the conjugal act itself, so that masturbation, whatever, is intrinsically disordered, intrinsically evil, potentially a mortal sin. You talk about tension, like that is it's impossible. Like I think it's literally impossible for most people, especially men, to go through a full marriage, use NFP, and never violate 2352. And for most men, it's a pretty common occurrence. And I get the fact that in the confessional, I think the priests are more or less tolerant of it. Some of them don't even raise an eyebrow. But you still have this. I mean, according to the letter of the law, it's an intrinsically grave evil, could separate you eternally from God. Like the fact that that's even written that way within the context of all this other stuff, I find nearly incomprehensible. Like that to me makes no sense, and I wish someone could make it make sense for me, because it just doesn't.
And one of the things that makes it difficult is that there is a lot of sense, I think, in what the church says about birth control in general. So, like, just sort of generally speaking, yes, birth control can be sort of abused. It can
Hmm.
lead to sort of thinking of your partner as, an object and that sort of thing. Um, but I think there's a lot of nuance missing there, because for one thing, there's a lot of couples who have long, wonderful marriages and they use contraception. They never even thought of it as, I'm talking about Catholic couples, but I'm just talking about couples in general. I don't think that it necessarily leads to, dissolution of a marriage. And actually, I think that a lot of the time you find that when you have, especially if people are not quite on board, maybe if you're really strict about NFP and Catholic teaching regarding sex in a marriage, it can actually introduce a lot of division within the marriage, and tension. I could see leading to the breakup of marriages, family issues, and all that kind of stuff. Even this the when it came to divorced and remarried couples, the sort of John Paul II solution was that these people they can stay married, but they should live as brother and sister. I find it very difficult to imagine a situation where they could a couple could do that and have it not affect their relationship profoundly to the point where they start drifting apart and eventually just separate anyway, which would and it would have an effect, I think, on the family as a whole. So yeah, it's very tricky when you see things that the church is recommending causing somewhat more problems, not leading to the sort of this blissful problem-free marriage that is kind of promised in the NFP. Right? And yeah, it's a very tricky thing.
Well, and I think it's one thing for marriage to be hard and for our faith to challenge us and to uh, submit our wills to things that maybe on our own accord we wouldn't necessarily reach that conclusion. But it's another thing to be obligated to do things based on rules that seem subject to scrutiny, but to be morally obligated to do things that are very likely harmful to yourself, your marriage, your children that are being raised in these households. I, I don't think that's an overstatement. I mean, I think following the rules to a T for a lot of couples is a great hazard to the marriage and to the well-being of the children that you're trying to raise for those reasons.
Yeah, I think it definitely can be. I mean, there are people who like it works perfectly for them, and that's great. I'm happy for them. And there's some people who, again, I've known Catholic families, some very large Catholic families, right? And the some of them are able to make it work very well. Others, it's much more difficult. People are different, and people's circumstances are different, and I think we always need to remember that. So it's, I mean, especially I've noticed that for someone to be able to follow church teaching to the letter, when it comes to their marriage, really helps if one of the people in the marriage has a decently lucrative profession, and the person's able to stay at home. So that's one example, right? Because if if you're having a lot of kids, it can be very difficult to manage that with if both parents are working, if you have babysitters and daycare and all those things going on at the same time, very difficult. So yeah, I always think people's circumstances have to be taken into consideration, and sometimes I think that people just imagine these kind of perfect Catholic couples living, they've, all their kids and their homestead, and their, that kind of thing. And it's too much of a romanticized ideal and not close enough to reality. I mean, that's what I really liked with Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia, and his sort of take on the divorced and remarried issue, that even if these people were in a situation where it would, being sort of living as brother and sister, could end up harming the family, actively harming the family, then, there are situations where they could live as a married couple, and still receive communion, not be considered outside the church. And I think maybe what triggered people about that, because this triggered like huge controversy, was the idea that it could be potentially applied to things like contraception. It could be applied to like other aspects of Catholic sexual teaching, this sort of diminished culpability idea. And I think there's been so much writing on this, making sure that there's no movement allowed on that particular issue, that helps explain some of the controversy that engendered.
That raises, I think 2 points. I mean, and that's just one thing, especially in this area, in particular, is it seems like there is so many black and white, gravely sinful things that you can do in the sexual realm of things, that most everything else, in a lot of, morally speaking, depends on the circumstances, right? There aren't a lot of like intrinsically grave things that most of us confront on a regular basis outside of the sexual relationship. But you have these very real circumstances that make it extremely difficult not to, I guess, fall into one of these things, if you want to call it that. So you have the circumstances where biologically and relationally we're confronted with this constantly in our homes, and then you have this like unlimited supplies of missteps that are intrinsically wrong. Like, we can't even talk about the circumstances; they're intrinsically wrong. Can't even talk about even the most extreme circumstances that any person with a reasonably functioning conscience would be like, obviously it's okay. Like, they're not doing anything wrong, but it's intrinsically wrong. We can't even entertain the idea. It's a real problem for the church, I think. And I don't know how we get past that, if we can.
Well, I think part of it is that part of the nature of Catholic moral theology itself, because it's coming at from this act-based perspective, right? So it looks at concrete acts, because a lot of it actually is sort of built around this idea that built around the idea of the confessional, that you go to to confession and you tell the priest, what you think you've done wrong, and then the priest will look at the act that you actually committed and tell you if it was wrong. But what's difficult about that is that when you get down to like basic physical acts, like sexual acts, or things to do with bioethic, there's no wiggle room at all. You're dealing with these like very, very concrete acts. Now, when you're looking at much broader issues, like when you're looking at how you behave at work, or how you treat your children, or how you the way that you think about the poor, or all of those, like, are actually like huge, big issues. Catholic moral theology gets much murkier, and there's a lot more room for differing sort of opinions. So unfortunately, it ends up being that these are the things we tend to focus on because the moral theology has shaped itself around this kind of act-based understanding of things. So, because if you look at something like say someone who's engaging in business practices that are immoral or illegal, and it's often very difficult. You'd have to look at there's many different acts that go into something like that. There's like a lot of different factors at play. Sometimes people are very removed from the actual sort of sinful thing that's going on. But when you're dealing with sexual act, not removed from them, you can't remove yourself from them at all. So again, it all comes back. So that's why I think there is truth to the idea that Catholics, obsessed with these sorts of things around sexual ethics in ways that even other Christians aren't. I mean, I think it's something within Christianity as a whole, but I think Catholics are ultra focused, and it's because of this tradition of sort of scholastic moral theology, and it's that heritage.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems to me that there seems to, whether they acknowledge it or not, the sexual appetite is obviously a very powerful force and can really get you into some bad situations if you're not in control of it. And there's definitely a fear of the slippery slope, but I think the census is like if we open the door even a crack, people are just gonna flood through it, and to their credit, people say, well, look at the Anglican Church now compared to where they were at the Lambeth Conference. Look at the predictions that Paul VI made in Humani Vitae. I mean, what's our response to that? Because if you look at that, it does seem like all of the fears, and at the end of the day, anything goes is the end product. Can we credibly say, well, we can open the door a little bit, consider some circumstances without just throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Or is that just naive thinking?
Well, I mean, I used to think that was the case, that if you bend on one issue, it's all going to crumble. But I think being around Catholics, and different parishes, and looking at the Catholic world as a whole for quite a while now, I realized those doors already opened. Like, so even though I would say within any parish, you may have like maybe 15 to 20 of the people who go there are, like, I would say, more like Orthodox, faithful Catholics. They tend to be the ones who are maybe most involved in church, and they're often the ones who are going to follow church teaching quite closely. And then I have 80% who are either going to sometimes not even know what the church teaches on these things, or they're going to be somewhere in between. Like, they might be sort of in a middle zone. So it's not like the Catholic world, like everyone's following this. Like, it's actually quite a small minority.
Well, that's what's so, like, what did we gain? I mean, they laid down the law, held to the story in Humani Vitae, and then yet most everyone just went off and did their own thing anyway. I mean, I sit in church regularly, and I look, and I'm just like, not that I'm judging other people, but you can just you can see what you're just talking about. I'm just like, I am so jealous. Like, there's part of me that's so jealous of people that just don't even give a thought to any of this stuff. Like,
yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I was looking. I really found it interesting to research Catholic thought in North America around the time of Vatican II. There was really this, I think, intellectual engagement with the church, super, like, a lot of enthusiasm about where the church was going, and this is like a new dawn kind of thing. And I think people were still at that point really thinking with the church, and really eager about this. But then Humanae Vitae comes along, and it causes this break where a lot of these people who had been very intellectually committed to the church all of a sudden think, I can't do this. Like, I can't shut my brain off or my critical thinking off here, or my conscience off, and just follow what the church said. And so you get this split forming where a lot of people are discovering the idea of conscience as a, for the first time in Catholicism. And that spreads through, much of the Catholic world in many ways. And so I think the way to heal this, if it's possible, would be to introduce some of those distinctions, those fine distinctions, keep them, they can be rigid, but allow for some exceptions. I think that's the key. We've seen when you deal with things that are considered intrinsically evil, you're always going to find that things are going to get very difficult at some point. If you're taking an absolutist position that this is never allowed under any circumstances, no matter what, no matter, like, at least at the edge cases, you're going to find some very difficult situations where there's no good answer. I think I remember Benedict got in a bit of a situation with a case, and this was an abortion case, where I think a girl had been raped by her father. She had an abortion performed on her, and anyway, the Pope Benedict took a hard line on this and sort of, condemned it, and condemned anyone who had been involved with it, but there's something at a moral level, we see that this is problematic. It's very hard to take like an absolutist position, and same comes with any kind of absolute, like, even we know that lying is intrinsically evil, according to the church, but on that, I think people are much looser, right? Like, we've even within the church, they've come up with sort of ways, reservation and things like that, to sort of allow for people to fudge the truth a little bit, without technically lying. So I don't know. It's I think that sort of moral theological absolutism, it feels good because it means that whatever we're teaching is true in all times, all places, that kind of idea. But it just clashes with reality sometimes. And I think that's the ultimate tension that the church is facing. It's a very nice abstract sort of moral apparatus that the church has, but try to put it into practice, and all of a sudden you reach these almost impossible situations.
I want to put Kevin Non-Tridacast's comment on here. You
Sure.
find the hard lining to really sustain credibility too. You can't lie to the Nazi at your door about the Jews in your attic. Come on. I mean, what I find troublesome is so much of this stuff, including in the sexual ethics realm, purports to be based on reason, right? Reason and natural law, not necessarily some dictate from a cloud. This is whether you're a believer or not. If you're just a rational, cold thinker, you can see these things, and yet these things don't seem obvious. And in fact, the opposite seems true on some of these things. That's where I really struggle too, because in some ways, it would be easier if they just said Pope Paul VI had a vision from heaven and said, no, this is it, as opposed to trying to weave it all together back to Aquinas and Augustine, who, no offense to those guys, they're bright guys, but they were human too, and they were dealing with much less sophisticated information about human biology. I mean, they didn't even understand egg and sperm conception until I think the 1800s, maybe 1700s, right? So that is troublesome to me, because they say, well, this is based on reason, and if you can't see it, well, you're just not a reasonable person. Well, what the heck does that mean? I'm not I mean, I'm not saying I'm the smartest guy in the world, but I usually my intuition is a pretty good benchmark for things, and this stuff just seems completely out of line to the point where you start to question, okay, is this even accurate? Should we believe this?
Well, I think when you're looking at Augustine and Aquinas and people like that, obviously these are, brilliant guys who a lot of what they thought ended up becoming, the foundations of Catholic thinking. But yeah, at the same time, their version of reason was a little different than the sort of modern version of reason. And I think there's a modern critique of that sort of ancient version of reason that I think
Yeah.
needs to be taken into consideration, especially
Right.
In the modern world. You get much more of an emphasis on, empiricism and science, learning. So you're not just kind of reasoning from this sort of abstract level down to the human level. You're starting at what are humans like and where do they come from? And then you kind of go from there. Now, it's not that you need to throw out everything that Aquinas said, but I think you need to bring them together somehow. Like there's a theologian, Bernard Lonergan, who around the time of Humanae Vitae, he wrote a letter which got published later on. He didn't actually publish this, but he criticized Humanae Vitae because he said that it took this sort of Aristotelian understanding of the sex act as always leading to procreation, as if every time you have sex, you get pregnant, right? Like but he said, no, it's actually a statistical relationship.
Series of probabilities or whatever.
Yeah, you may have sex 10 times, and one of those times it leads to conception. And so contraception would be just sort of altering that statistical relationship in the same way that natural family planning is altering that statistical relationship as well, focusing on the times when you're least likely to get pregnant, right? So that was his criticism, and I think it's a somewhat valid one because it was based on an understanding of how this actually works in real people's lives, not a sort of abstract idea about what the human organs are for and what their teleological purpose is and all this kind of thing, which is, somewhat artificial and sort of idealized.
Yeah. I mean, I wish it were, if the church had just said, look, this is hard stuff, and we offer this to you as the safest approach for people to live their married lives and avoid, let's say, the pitfalls that can go with contraception or the whatever. Like, if you want the surest, safest way that you're being open to life, you're taking your vow to welcome children seriously, to treat your spouse respectfully, here's the model for you to follow. If it were presented that way, as opposed to this is the way, and if you deviate even the slightest from it, you may be cutting yourself off from God for eternity. Those are two very different ways of presenting the same thing, right?
Yeah, I think you just say it would be better for the church to just back off a bit from people, from the lives of married couples, and to allow married couples to listen to church teaching as a whole and try to make that concrete in their married life, but leave the details to them, right? And I think a lot of other, Christian denominations done that. Even I think in the Orthodox Church there was one time a very strong condemnation of contraception. Now it's much more. It's something they just kind of back off from. That's my understanding anyway. And I know that even with like evangelical circles where people are like very, very intensely Christian, contraception doesn't really come up as a big issue in many cases, except in some of these particular like quiverful type movements and things like that. But yeah, so it's it's something that doesn't need to be necessarily looked at through a magnifying glass like it often is in the church. I think we can say that maybe, people have developed enough of an understanding of their own sexuality and sexual relationships to that in marriage, we should be able to sort of handle these things ourselves. And I don't know, I think that be a good path for the church. In the end, we're taking it upon ourselves. We don't get that. If someone does that, if a couple does that, they're sort of taking things into their own hands. And there's a certain, I guess, risk that comes with that, because if you follow, there's a sort of sense of assuredness of, I guess, eventual salvation. If you're following everything to the letter, exactly as the church says, if you take something into your own hands, your own conscience, there's, you can't be assured. You can't have that sort of absolute faith. But at the same time, I don't know, maybe that's a step that some couples need to take. I don't know. But
Yeah, I mean,
again,
I think some people maybe, I think of I sometimes wonder if the Augustine types aren't, given their past, so distrustful of themselves that they want and need that kind of ironclad, this is a line you don't cross, for themselves. And if other people have an opening, that more or less gives me an opening, and I don't trust myself. There's a rumor a priest told me, I don't know if it's true or not, but the rumor is that St. Alphonsus Liguori, who I think is one of the, I don't find him a real uplifting person to read, when it comes to this stuff.
yeah.
Supposedly he had people tie his hands behind his back because he did not trust himself to let his hands wander where they I'm like, how much of this is just the super scrupulous, super neurotic people sort of, I don't know, get elevated and their views and stuff get developed, because the rest of us are just kind of living our lives. We're not, we're fine. We give us a little discretion. We may not be perfect, but we'll make good more often than we make bad. But then there's just those handful of people that's like, I can't trust it. I can't have a drop of alcohol or I won't stop, kind of thing, feels like that is sort of what might be going on in the background.
Yeah, I think there's the baggage of I guess the ascetic kind of tradition in the church, and this sort of, what would you call it, elevation of virginity, and the association of sex with things that are unclean. And I know that's not exactly how teaching presents, but there's something that's there in church history. And I mean, you do have these sort of extreme figures who go very far in removing themselves from any kind of temptation, anything that would even remind themselves of their sort of earthly desires, kind of thing.
Right.
And yeah, I think it could become a kind of neurosis that builds in the church over time. And now there are some people who I think maybe are called to this kind of thing, right? Like these are the sort of people meant for that kind of extreme life, apart from other people, apart from a celibate life. I mean, and many priests, I think, I'm sometimes critical of the idea of like enforced priestly celibacy, but at the same time, I think that celibacy can be a great thing for people who are like called to that. I just don't know if every priest is actually called to that, but yeah, it seems like some of these ascetic ideals then get applied to everyone in the church, not a sort of just the people who are kind of set aside to for that purpose.
Yeah, and I mean, even if we want to say here's a heroic level. Like if you want to live a heroically virtuous life, this is what you do, and maybe that's going to put you on a path to not just being saved, but to be a saint, like you enter heaven right away. Fine, but the heroic level is the baseline. Like if you can't keep up with the heroic requirements, anything short of that is a sin that if you don't go to confession, you might be damning yourself to hell. Like the drop off from what's expected of you is so severe that I think that I guess is where I really struggle with. Like I said, if that was presented as, if you want to be a martyr, if you want to be a married martyr, go knock yourself out. But to impose on everyone and to say, if you can't do that, you may not be saved at all, I think is a real, I think that's a real hard sell.
Yeah, it's a very hard sell. I don't think that everyone can be sort of heroic in that sense. And do we need everyone to be sort of heroes of sexual morality? We can have some people be heroes of other types of morality as well. Like, so I'd much rather have a church where you have a lot of people with their own failings, their own, but you have a much more varied group of people, not just everyone kind of focusing, just worried about this or that, whether that sexual act is going to send them to hell. And, like that, to me, it ends up focusing the church on the wrong things. And it even can affect, there's many things that I love about John Paul II, but I think when he talked about things like the contraceptive mentality and how this affects like everything else that you do in your life, as if contraception is like the beginning of every other evil. To me, I just don't buy that. I don't see that as, when I look around at people outside the church and I look around at people, there's so many good people out there who do great things who might use contraception.
They're still having kids. They're still having families. They love their kids and their grandkids. And
yeah, that's the thing. I think the Catholic family values are very beneficial in many ways. Like again, the sort of the sexual stuff specifically gets very tricky, but I think in general, Catholic family values are very good. But we can't always imagine that every other type of family is like some kind of deviant, family. Because again, there's people who are they're not religious at all, but they have great families. They love each other. They support each other. They do good things. It's so yeah. I think that we have to have a bit of maybe humility in that sense, and see that we don't need to be like the sort of bulwark stopping the rest of the world or stopping everyone from falling into total depravity or something like that, because I don't think people are falling into total depravity. There's some in the world, but I think generally speaking, a lot of people end up getting married, end up having kids. It's difficult, these are the normal things of life that we all go through. It doesn't matter whether we're Christian, doesn't matter whether we're like Muslim or secular or whatever. So I think we need to make space, I think, in for different types of families, different types of ways of relating to each other within families, all that stuff. So I'd like to see more of that in the church, and I think I could see that in Pope Francis. I think he's been trying to bring that into Catholic life, just less focus. He's not going to change. He's not the kind of guy who's going to change anything doctrinal, like in any kind of sort of like official way like that. But he's the kind of guy who's going to change the focus, so we're not just so laser focused on that stuff all the time.
Well, and I appreciate that. I hope that what we are on is on a journey, on the development, as opposed to, let's say, John Paul II was the end of the line. And I see a lot of in our space. I see people, and I'm opening up to the idea of your conscience, and you know, following it, but it's hard to not turn off that little voice in the back of your head. Like, what if there's a 1% chance that the Father Rippagers of the world are right, and this single act that my wife and I just did is going to erase all the good that we've done in our marriage, and it's going to overlook the fact that we had 12 kids, and it's, I don't care who you are, it's hard to like completely shut out those voices when, as Catholics, there is that, it's baked into the fabric. I still struggle with that a lot. I've kind of come to peace a little bit with some of the stuff, but it doesn't eliminate the angst, but maybe it's not supposed to. Maybe that's the tension we're supposed to live with. I don't know.
I mean, I think that the tension is always going to be there. But at the same time, we can lessen the intensity of the tension. And I think one of the things that I found anyway, that was really helpful, was to read outside of Catholicism specifically. So like looking at other types of Christians and other moral theological traditions. And you see that, okay, this is, they can be equally intense about other things. They don't happen to be as intense about these specific sexual things. Even, and just kind of looking at the Christian world as a whole, I think this thing that, is causing so much tension is something that is kind of specific to Catholics. And I think it comes from, like, this has always been a thing with the division between East and West, that the West wanted to sort of catalog everything and judge every little act and place it all within the context of this huge apparatus of moral
perfect order.
Perfect order. Yeah.
Yep.
And that's been the sort of the fatal flaw almost of the West, in the same way that, I mean, I think every denomination has its own sort of fatal flaws, right? Like they've got these, but that's maybe ours, is that there's this tendency to just intellectualize and be absolutist in doing so. And it can end up creating these kind of problems, especially for people who maybe take the faith at a very, like I do, and maybe you do as well, like at a kind of like more intellectual level, like where you're really thinking about doctrine, and you're thinking there are plenty of Catholics where it's much more loose, they're not thinking about doctrine all the time, right? And maybe that's okay too, right? Like this a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of, let's not worry so much about this. I mean, and I think there have been some, like, I know Cardinal McElroy wrote a piece where he was hoping that Catholic moral theology could be changed so that sexual acts would be seen as, I think it was like more like essentially kind of venial sins rather than always something morally grave. And at least that, I think, would be some progress there, to just take the emphasis off of it. And so we can, in part, it's one of the things that disillusioned me as well, that I really wanted to hear Catholic voices speaking with real integrity and force about all sorts of things in our world. And I found that I wasn't hearing that, and it kept focusing on the same things to do with, bioethics. And so it ended up being like, it just felt so lopsided. I think we're missing so much by being so focused on that.
If Paul VI had rewrote Humanae Vitae a little bit and basically said, here's the deal. The conjugal act, this is special. When you come together in this way, it needs to be respected. But couples, use your imagination and reason and self-respect to find ways to keep your intimate life together outside of the conjugal act. And if that was the standard, it would still be difficult. Like, any of your alternatives are never as good as the real thing, right? And so there's going to be a sacrifice there. But for most people, I think most of us, we could most of us could manage under those circumstances, I would not have a podcast. I'd have a podcast maybe about helping the poor and stuff, right? But instead, this
Yeah.
is my life. I think the church could have offered a much more realistic alternative to what, let's say, even evangelical Christianity was offering, and say, we uphold the conjugal act when it happens, this to be it, but we also respect couples' abilities and rights to use their reason outside of it to maintain the relationship and not worry about whether it's a sin or not. I think for a huge chunk of people, they could operate within that. It wouldn't be easy. And maybe then you have provisions for those that even that's not a viable option. Like that would mean they would literally go months or years without being able to be intimate, and then you can deal with that on a case by case basis. But I think the church had an opportunity to present that as a viable, and I would be gung ho. I would be the best salesman for that. I think most people could find their marriage could be the right blend of enjoyment but sacrifice. But as it is, I seriously question whether to tell my kids to get married, because I think it's so difficult and so consuming that, like I said, just trying to think about other things to foster other virtues is really, really, really difficult.
I think it helps to know that even within the institutional church, there's been a lot of people who have felt that way. So even John Paul I, who died after just a very short time as Pope, he, before Humanae Vitae, he was very hopeful that
Yeah.
birth control, or the pill specifically, would be approved as okay. And he even wrote, I believe, like a report, or was conducted sent some kind of report anyway to the Pope to that effect. And he was very, I think, took it very hard when Humanae Vitae turned out the way it did. And I know that I had read about him. Part of it was motivated by seeing, working class dads where he lived, who had 10 kids, no job, didn't know how they were going to possibly feed these kids, and just completely crushed by the responsibility and the hopelessness of the situation. And I think he thought that, there has to be some kind of way out of this. But yeah, no, Mike has said that conspiracy theories are.
I was going to say, Mike Lewis said, I'm going to ask you about conspiracy theories. I'm wondering if this is one of them.
There's some people, and now I got to say, I don't believe this conspiracy theory, but there's some people who say that John Paul I was like just about to initiate a change on contraception, and then all of a sudden he died. Yeah. he was perhaps poisoned, perhaps whatever. I don't believe it, but I think I've looked at the evidence. I have no idea if he was planning anything in that regard, because he didn't have a chance to even be Pope for that long. So but yeah, I think it's something that's not going to go away. It's going to stay there. It's going to be, even if it just continues, things continue the way they are, where there's this sort of uneasy tension where 80% of Catholics have kind of taken it in, are either using, appealing to their conscience, or I've just completely ignored the teaching. And then, you've got the 20% who are maybe agonizing over this and trying to do it as best they can. That may go on. I don't know. But it would be nice to see, I think, a Pope, that maybe is brave enough to at least confront the issue head on and look at it realistically. Even if there can't be, even if it's deemed to be impossible to make a sort of doctrinal change in that regard. And I don't think it should be impossible, but even if it is, at least to bring it out in the open again, to have these conversations, to sort of ease some of that tension, I think is important, because it's still there since 1968. It's still, lingering.
Yeah, this is where I become less doctrinal and I become a little more pragmatic, and I'm like, I mean, Casti Connubii came out, Humani Vitae came out, and I firmly believe that had Casti Connubii not just been issued, 30, 40 years earlier, Humani Vitae may have come out differently. But now we have Casti Connubii, now we have Humani Vitae, Theology of the Body. Like, I just don't see an environment to be any meaningful alteration from that apparatus, and the only option I see available to the Pope, and even this is going to require to fall on a sword a little bit, is to say, to the extent we've told couples that finishing any other way other than during intercourse is wrong, like, that's at least kind of gray. I mean, it's sort of always been taught, but it hasn't been like doctrinally defined or whatever. It's not in the humanity. It's not an encyclical whatever. And I think it would make. I mean, it would sure make a lot of difference for couples, I think. And so, I guess I'm hoping the Pope will say other acts and stuff are okay, or couples can consider that, because as it is just like you said, constant tension if you're trying to apply these rules completely.
Yeah, and there's a theologian. I mean, he's a bit notorious among some people, but Hans Kung. He was one of the big sort of Vatican II era theologians, but then sort of fell afoul of the church in the 70s. But he wrote a book called Infallible: An Inquiry, and this was not long after Humanae Vitae. And yeah, he thought that Humanae Vitae, the decision that was made, he actually believed that Pope Paul VI wanted to change the teaching.
I've heard that, yeah.
But in the end felt that it was impossible because he was constrained by this idea of the infallibility of church teaching.
Yep.
And so Kung he's dead now, but he came up with this idea that, the church should give up this idea of infallibility and instead focus on indefectibility. So the church is always going to go towards this goal that it's trying to get to. Sometimes it may make mistakes. It may go off the rails a little, but it'll always get back on. That's the kind of thing. Whereas with the infallibility idea, it's always the church never makes mistakes.
Yeah, you can't take a piece out, right? It's all or nothing.
And it's too much. It's too, it puts too much of a burden on every aspect of church teaching.
Yeah.
To the point that, I mean, we've seen the fallout of certain, even very minor tweaks. So, and it causes people to lose like almost their whole faith in the church.
Well, that's just it. I mean, I think for a lot of people, Kevin Non-Tradicath was in here earlier. I think for some people, it's any step back is to lose the entire thing. And that's a shame for people that are 99% there, but this one thing I just cannot accept. If it's all or nothing, I guess I'm nothing, right? And you kind of, people feel forced out, even though all they want is to not be pressed into acquiescence on this one thing or that one thing. I feel bad for people. I feel fortunate in that I'm still here. I'm still practicing. I plan to stay that way, but it's required me to, like I said, to adjust my perspective just a little bit to accommodate these things.
Well, I should say, one of the people in the comments there, pick and choose, said, to ask about any of the Eastern Catholic approaches to these issues. I think looking at that, I actually don't know when it comes to Eastern Catholic, but I know that the Eastern Orthodox approach to these issues is much, it's just a little more hands off, I guess you would say, like a little like, so there's much more of a tendency in the Eastern Church to leave some things
Yeah.
unexplained or unaddressed. And even within theology, some things are just a mystery
Yeah.
and we can't really wrap our heads around it. Whereas, in the Western Church, we want to define things and rationalize things as much as we can. Um, I've found that, yeah, the best antidote to being sort of consumed by these problems within the Catholic Church is to get that outside perspective. I find now that I feel, I'm a bit of a disaffected Catholic, I'm a little outside. I feel better about the church now than I did
Mm.
when I was in it. I kind of see it as, the church makes mistakes. It's got beautiful teachings. It's got this, some incredible, accomplishments, and the things that it's done for humanity are
Yes.
incredible. But it's not perfect,
Yeah.
and it's not, necessarily infallible in every respect. And it has these tensions and flaws and historical baggage and all that, just like the Eastern Orthodox Church does, just like Protestants do. And just, seeing things from that perspective for me has been very therapeutic, I think. Realizing that, when we put like absolute faith in the perfection of something, we're always going to be disappointed because it's never going to live up to that reality. So I'd rather have a flawed church that's a real church that actually, people can actually really relate to and live within and be part of and feel normal within, and not feel sort of caught up in all these, psychological tensions.
Yeah. I mean, I think of my spouse, my wife. I love more than any other person on this earth. She's not perfect. She doesn't have to be perfect. But I give my whole self to her, and I don't know why we have to be quite so concerned about perfection when it comes to the church, especially where a lot of the church is made up of us. We're all imperfect. A lot of this stuff wasn't revealed in Scripture. It's been sort of organic over time. Good people, flawed people, trying to make the best with the information they have. I think we would all be much better off if we could if we were felt like we could have that approach to the church.
Yeah, I think your analogy with marriage and the family is a good one, because if you idealize the family, it's going to be harsh when reality hits, right? And families can be so messy and chaotic and difficult. But that's what makes them good. And that's, and same with marriages, they can be messy and chaotic and difficult. And, but that actually strengthens, in a way, the bond. Ultimately, you're not just seeing each other as these idealized representations, or you're seeing each other as real people. And I think the church itself, it's made up of real people who, make mistakes and have all sorts of weird hangups, and we were doing our best.
And maybe the church should feel a little more relatable to people. Maybe people would identify a little more with something that didn't have to be perfect, right? Maybe more people would feel attracted to it. I don't know.
And and I think you see how with the abuse crisis and everything, you saw how a church that presented itself as being, the epitome of moral perfection, all of a sudden the whole thing crumbles, and you see there's this evil going on within it, and it's been going on for quite a while. And that should be a lesson right there, that we try to maintain that facade. Doing that actually helps to cover up things that might be going on inside. We're ignoring things by not addressing them, and not dealing with these difficult issues.
Absolutely. Well, I have been kind of watching the clock. I have to pick up a couple of my kids from archery practice in a few minutes here. So I have really, really enjoyed this.
It was great talk. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I know that people in the comments felt the same way. I hope we can maybe do this again sometime, because I think we're really onto something here that is really important to talk about.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
All right. I'll put your Twitter. Maybe you don't want your Twitter handle in the description, but I'll put it in the description. Do you do like
Oh, that's fine.
Substack or anything like that? That you,
I do. Yes. It's actually in my Twitter
Twitter bio.
description. I think I have the Substack link there. Yeah.
Okay, I'll put that in the YouTube description as well. If people want to go check that out, I'd encourage them to do so.
Wonderful.
All right.
All right. Thanks so much. Yeah, for having me. It's great.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone who was in the comments. And yeah, until next time, everyone. Have a good one.
All right.